Two of a topic which we began last week, dealing with interesting and well trodden upon topic, which is whether or not Judaism espoused vegetarianism. But that's only going to be the jumping off point to discuss something much larger and really fascinating, and even has, I think, very significant implications for the way we relate to ourselves and to other people. So it'll become a very big topic, as you'll hopefully see soon. Now, last week we took a look at the fact that it's very clear from the Torah that in the Garden of Eden, everybody was what they call in Israel tiv oni, vegan, not just vegetarianism, but vegan, right? No animal products at all. Even the animals were vegan in the Garden of Eden. And only after the flood was there permission given to eat meat. And of course, the implications of that are a little obscure. Why was it forbidden in the Garden of Eden and then permitted only after the flood? And only every possible explanation that you could possibly think of has been suggested. And they go in absolutely opposite directions. So some of the theories suggest that it represents some kind of decline of morality, that we're now allowed to eat meat, a kind of concession, analogous to the permission of Eshet Yifat Toar, of capturing a non-Jewish woman in war, that the Talmud says is a concession to the Yetzer Hara, evil impulse, and this is something similar to that. And explanations which go the exact opposite direction, which suggest that man, only after the flood, for reasons we can't go into right now, had developed enough sophistication that justified the eating of meat. Because after all, you are what eats you. And so therefore, if a human being and an animal are essentially on the same level, then when we eat the cow, since the cow is not experiencing elevation, there's no justification for eating the cow. However, now that we are superior, we have dot. This is according to one of the opinions we saw. We now have dot, which we didn't have before. So therefore, with this newfound dot, this intellect that we have, only subsequently in Jewish history do we sufficiently raise the animal to justify eating the animal. And we found that in a midrash. And so then you could ask the question, so why wasn't eating meat permitted immediately after the acquisition of dot, which presumably was a function of eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, Eitz HaDat, Tovara. And the answer given so that we don't reward people for sin, right? Because if God would have said, oh, now you possess dot, you're actually very sophisticated now because you ate from the tree, and one implication is that you can eat meat. So then Adam and Chava would have said, wow, that was pretty good. We sinned because now we're on this higher level and we get to have such good barbecues now. So we don't want an attitude like that towards sin. So in any case, every possible explanation you could think of has been suggested. And of course, the bottom line is we don't know the reason ultimately why meat was not permitted in the Garden of Eden, and then as subsequent to the flood is permitted. But what we saw at the very end of last week is that Rav Kook, without any doubt and with no ambiguity whatsoever, suggests that the ideal is, in fact, Gan Eden. It's the ideal that we have a sense of tzedek, a sense of justice towards animal life. And the taking of animal life, there's a certain immorality to that. And it cannot possibly be that the concession to be able to eat meat, which was given after the flood, that would be permanent. It's impossible. Hang on a second, Bruce. Because since we have confidence that ultimately the world will be dominated by justice and peace, it's impossible that the concession to eat meat, in which there's a certain amount of acceptance of cruelty to animals and indifference to the value of animal life, how could that possibly coexist with a perfected world? Rav Kook says that very explicitly in his essay on the vision of vegetarianism and peace, and that's where we left out last week. Bruce, go ahead.
I'm wondering if this is not a perfect example of having a certain cultural, contextual mindset, and then looking back into Torah and saying, "Aha, that justifies my perspective." Or are we really reading the Torah cold and letting it speak to us? And that's really what we think the Torah is alluding to in this Gan Eden story. I mean, I don't see
So,
any injustice or cruelty. You have to really read into that. So I'm just wondering if it's not projecting back and
yeah.
whether that's really fair to the text.
Okay, it's a good question. One thing I think is fair, and that is that if we assume that the Garden of Eden represents an ideal, which I think is a fair assumption, and since the text explicitly forbids eating of meat, so therefore it's very compelling to say that the ideal existence does not involve eating of meat. So I don't think I think that's actually almost an inescapable reading of the text.
I think
Uh,
calling it an ideal is somewhat of a leap. My kids also, they first went to Gan when they were little. Gan doesn't have to be the ideal existence. It's just the initial existence for which God put them in the Gan. And he
yeah,
might have had every reason
yeah,
for later them to graduate and leave
uh,
one day.
yeah. So I actually would. Okay, I hear what you're saying. We could. I don't want to beat a dead horse,
Well, that
but
wouldn't be very nice. That would be cruel.
right, that's true. So and just briefly, the notion that Gan Aden is like a Gan Yeladim, and that we've matured, I think would be reading a lot into the text, and that might actually suffer from a kind of modern sensibility of sort of evolution. We're evolving, we're growing, and the Garden of Eden was not the ideal. And I don't want to get into exactly why now, but God puts an angel there with a flaming sword. They can't go back. Somehow this is an ideal. So, and we're only kicked out because of sin. So I think it's the fairest reading of the text that represents an ideal. Fine. Now, I want to point out that Rav Kook's attitude towards animal life is very consistent, because another obvious expression of that issue would be animal sacrifice. And here we're going to see a very, very famous passage from Rav Kook, in which he interprets a verse from Malachi, the prophet Malachi. There, the prophet says the following, and the prophet is describing the ideal world, and the prophet says, "Va'arvat laHashem minchad Yudav Yerushalayim," that at that time, this future time, there will be sweet to the Lord the grain offering of Yehuda and Yerushalayim, as it was in ancient times. That's what the verse says. That Minchat Yehuda Yerushalayim, the grain offering of Yehuda and Yerushalayim, will be sweet to the Lord as in days of old. So what does that mean? So Rav Kook discusses it, and he says the following. And this is really extraordinary, what he says. Matter of fact, I think, did I do this last time? Maybe I ended with this. Does anybody? Okay, so let me just, I think I did do this last time. So let me just review instead of reading in the words. Rav Kook is totally consistent. And he explains, why will grain offerings at that time be sweet to the Lord? Excuse me. So he says that the end of days will involve a complete transformation of the nature of humanity, to the extent, and he's not making this up, Yeshayahu says it, the whole world will be full of the knowledge of the Lord, even animals. Yeshayahu says this explicitly. And therefore, animals no longer be dangerous. Yeshayahu says this explicitly. I have the passage here. We saw it last week. So Rav Kook now puts two and two together and says the following. Why is it that we offer up animal offerings now? He says based upon mystical ideas, that we are elevating the animals. We're doing them a favor. They become an offering to the Lord. How do we become elevated? We become elevated through the use of our dot. We go to the Beit HaMikdash. We experience that experience. We learn Torah, etc. We become elevated through dot. Animals don't have dot. But Yeshayahu says that in the ultimate world to come, the animals also will have dot. So therefore, they will elevate themselves in the same way we elevate ourselves now, not by being acted upon, but through their own usage of the faculty of dot, of intellect. And therefore, there will be offerings in this messianic world, but not from animals. Animals will do it by learning in the Efrat Kollel, as we pointed out last week. And the only thing left to offer up will be that which comes from lower forms of existence, grain offerings. That's how Rav Kook explains that passage in the Prophet Malachi. Okay, so we see Rav Kook is extremely consistent in his.
That would make sense. Is Zev Gar and Kevis.
That's the passage from Yeshayahu. That is the passage.
Yeah, I'm saying that's exactly. They will become vegetarians as well.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, fine. So now we have a little problem here. The problem is that Rav Kook contradicts himself, because Rav Kook, we happen to know, was a Kohen, like Bruce. And we know that Rav Kook explicitly, in various sources, says that there will be animal sacrifices, and he looks forward to serving the Beit HaMikdash. Offering up korbanot, he means animal sacrifices.
And Rav Kook was not a vegan.
And Rav Kook was not a vegan. So Rav Kook ate chicken on Shabbat and Yom Tov. He also encouraged, we have a letter from Rav Kook to his son, which he encourages his son to eat meat. So I'm confused. This is a very famous contradiction.
Wait a minute. Rav Kook wrote in the pamphlet, The Vision of Vegetarianism and Peace. He had a separate pamphlet about this. And basically, he had some very sharp words for people promoting vegetarianism in his days. So Arthur,
hang on a second. So if you say too much, I won't have anything left to say.
I'm sorry.
So, that's all right. But you're going to give this year next week. So believe it or not, what I'm just telling you right now, so you just feel better. You're 100% right. But somehow that point that you're about to make, which I'm going to make eventually, flew past people, and they somehow didn't notice that he actually, even though he says there's a certain cruelty to it, and it will not be forever, however, he definitely also says that we should not make it public policy to be vegan. So still there's a certain, like, well, why not exactly? So we'll have to flesh all that out. So there is seemingly contradictions in Rav Kook's writings about the attitude towards animals. So I finally only understood this a couple weeks ago. I want to share that process with you. This is where it gets very fascinating and big, very big in its implications. So first of all, I want to show you a rather striking passage that we find. There is a discussion in the Talmud about the ultimate disposition of mitzvot in general. There's an opinion in the Talmud that says that there'll be no mitzvot in Latid Lavo. Latid Lavo means future world, that perfected messianic world. No mitzvot. Here, if you take like Vayikra Rabbah, it says concerning korbanot, no korbanot. Kol korbanot b'telim. No korbanot in the Latid Lavo, in the perfected world. Now, we're going to take a look at one of the most fascinating collections of Rav Kook's writings, and some of the most challenging. Rav Kook's letters, many of them, were collected. These are real letters written to individuals responding to their questions. called Igrot Raya, letters of Rav Kook. We know who the letters are to, right? Each letter says, to the great rabbi, blah, blah, it tells his name, has the date on it. Unfortunately, we don't usually have the original letter that Rav Kook received, to which he's responding. So we have to guess a little bit. Now, one of the letters from that Rav Kook responded to was to a rabbi named Alexandrov. I'm going to tell you a little bit about him and speculate what the issue was, and you'll see where this is going to go. This rabbi, I did some research about this rabbi. He's not very well known nowadays. He learned with Rav Kook in Volozhin. If you look him up in Wikipedia, Alexandrov, he looks like a typical Haredi rabbi of that time. But he became radicalized. Now, till his dying day, he was a pious Jew. So on that level, he was not radicalized. But he became very close to members of the Haskalah, of the intellectual movement, to view Judaism in a very modern light. And members of the Haskalah were often not religious, irreligious. Also with radical secular Zionist thinkers, he became very close to them. And not close to them in the sense that Rav Kook was. Rav Kook looks like a very conservative, with a small c, rabbi compared to Rav Alexandrov. Rav Kook, even though he sympathizes with certain aspects of Zionist ideology, a lot of his closeness to the Zionists was out of tolerance and love, but not buying into their ideology. Rabbi Alexandrov buys into the ideology with very radical theological ideas, to the extent that if we say that there'll be no mitzvot, latid lavo, there's an opinion like that in the Talmud. The abandonment of mitzvot could be seen in some scary way as a kind of progressive move towards an ideal messianic era. Is that clear what I just said? Now, again, we don't have Rabbi Alexandrov's original letter, so it's hard to know, but that's what it sounds like from the way Rav Kook responds. Now, I'm going to have to leave you in suspense for a second about how Rabbi Kook responds to this issue of mitzvot won't be operative in the world to come, and so therefore, lack of observance could be in some way seen as being progressive, even from a Jewish theological point of view. Set that aside for a second. I want to look at a very famous issue, and you'll see how this very famous issue will inform Rav Kook's response to Rabbi Alexandrov. And that is, when we talk about Latid Lavo, the messianic future world, what's it going to look like? It's going to look like. So this is a very famous dispute, which I think we once discussed at length. So we're just going to revisit it very quickly. We have the view of the Rambam. The Rambam says, don't think that anything will change in terms of the natural functioning of the world in the future. Everything that is part of nature will change. Will not change, according to the Rambam. And then he quotes our pasuk from Yeshayahu, "Vigar ze'ev im keves," right? That we're going to have the wolf and the lamb, etc., lying together, and they won't kill each other. What do you do about that? That seems to reflect a supernatural existence. So he says, "Mashal v'chida." It's a metaphor. To what? Inyan Adavar Yisrael Yoshin Levetach. It means that Jews will dwell in peace and security. Imri Sheyakum Amishulim Kazev Ben Amer. That those who were formerly we were scared of, the idolatrous nations, we don't have to be scared of them in the Messianic future. There's going to be peace and security. Fine. So, Rabbi Avram ben David, a contemporary, the Ravid of the Rambam, says, "Are you crazy, Rambam? I don't know what you're talking about." It says in the Torah explicitly that God is going to put an end to the wild, threatening beasts in the earth, describing the Messianic future. That passage is understood in the Torah as being Messianic future. And if you take a look at source number 14 here, this is the passage. The Torah says, in the Messianic future, I'm going to place peace in the land, God says. Ushchabtem, you will be able to rest, to lie down, vein machrid, no fear. Bishbati chayara minarts, and I'm going to cause the evil beast to cease from the land. V'cherev lo ta'avor b'artzachem, no more war, no sword will pass in your land. So the Ravad says, Mr. Rambam, how could you say that nothing's going to change in the nature of the world? Everything will be natural. The Torah itself says that that's not true. The evil beast will depart from the world. Okay. Now it turns out that this dispute, whether the Messianic world will be natural or supernatural, is already a dispute in the Midrash. We have Rambam and the Ravid in the Middle Ages, but we have in the Midrash itself. And it's on that very pasuk, that pasuk, we find the following Midrash. We'll just read this in English. I will eliminate vicious beasts from the land. Rabbi Yehuda says, he will eliminate them from the world. Rabbi Shimon says, no, that's not what it means. It means he will prevent them from causing harm. So we'll understand this dispute better in a second. Rabbi Shimon said, wait a second, I'll prove that what I'm saying is correct, that it means he will prevent them from causing harm. What redounds more to the praise of the Lord? The absence of harmful agents, harmful beasts, like you say, Rabbi Yehuda, or they're existing but not causing harm? That's more miraculous, more impressive. That's my opinion. So that must be what is meant. And thus it is written, and the wolf will live with the lamb, and the leopard will lie down with the kid, and etc. All of those passages from Yeshayahu again, which describe a miraculous transformation of the nature of animals. So Rabbi Shimon says that's consistent with my view that there'll be a change in nature. So it turns out that the dispute between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon is the same dispute between the Rambam, who holds like Rabbi Yehuda, and the Ravid, who holds like Rabbi Shimon. Now, yes.
I think you in a prior shir mentioned zoos. And if you go to a zoo today, it sort of fits this pattern of animals lying next to each other in each stall. And it's very different from what was in antiquity. And that could be, and so today's sons could reflect this without any supernatural event taking place.
Okay, so actually it wasn't me who gave the zoo analogy. I think it was you. But But in any case, hang on to that for a second, because we have to see the Ramban. We're going to see an amazing, amazing Ramban. Now, bear in mind, Ramban is a Kabbalist. So we would expect him to side with the Ravid against the Rambam, which is true. But look how he explains the Midrash that we just saw. Amazing Midrash. And Bruce, you'll see how this touches on your issue. Right, the Torah says, I will cause evil beasts to cease out of the land. And the Midrash says, two opinions. Rabbi Yehuda says, the beasts will not be there. Rabbi Shimon says, no, they will be there. But their nature is going to change. We won't have to be scared of them anymore. And if you look at the Midrash, as we just saw, seems to be more sympathetic to the second view, the supernatural view, because the Midrash spends time justifying that view. Whereas Rabbi Yehuda is just one sentence, the Midrash goes on at some length. So it seems like that's the sympathetic view of the Midrash. Now look how the Ramban explains this. Quotes the pasuk. I will cause. This is in commentary on the Torah. I will cause evil beasts to cease out of the land. According to Rabbi Yehuda in the Midrash, who said that he will remove them from the world entirely, the verse is to be understood in its plain sense, that the evil beasts will not come into the land. For since there will be plenitude and abundance of blessings, and the cities will be full of people, wild beasts will not come into inhabited places. A totally naturalistic conception. So this, you have to give the zoo analogy, right? It's just that, generally speaking, I haven't seen coyotes walking down the streets of Efrat. Okay, why? Because coyotes don't like to be around people. Generally speaking, wild animals don't like to be around people. So if they can be out in the hills where there's no buildings, they stay there. So that's all Rabbi Yehuda is saying. There's no miraculous transformation. The evil beast will cease out of the land just means that because there will be great civilization, beautiful cities, paved streets, the animals are not going to go near you. They're going to stay in the forest where they feel safe. Fine. Totally naturalistic. Now, what about Rabbi Shimon? What does he say? Look how the Ramban explains it. And according to Rabbi Shimon, who says that he will cause them to cease from causing harm, he says there will be lions, tigers, and bears walking down the streets of Efrat. But you know what's going to happen? God is going to take the evil out of the beasts. So when the Torah says, I will cause evil beasts to cease out of the land, should you read the Hebrew to mean the beasts will cease or the evil of the beasts will cease? That's the two different ways of reading the verse. The verse is stating, and I will cause the evil of the beasts to cease out of the land. The Hebrew could bear, apparently, both those readings. This is now, so where does the Ramban weigh in? If you had to guess, is he Rabbi Yehuda, Rambam, or is he Rabbi Shimon, Ravid? And you could guess that he's like the mystical school. He's Ravid, Ramban. This is the correct interpretation. God is going to change their nature. The evil of the beasts will disappear. Why? Now, we a few minutes ago raised the issue of what is the significance of the Garden of Eden. Is that a Gan Yeladim, as Bruce wanted to say? It's kindergarten. We're past that. Or is it the ideal? Look at this Ramban. For when Israel observes the commandments, the land of Israel will be like the world was at its beginning, before the sin of the first man, when no wild beasts or a creeping thing would kill a man. We return to the Garden of Eden. That is the goal of history. Just as the rabbis have said, it is not the wild ass that kills, but it is sin that kills. It is because of this that Scripture says, and the suckling child shall play in the hole of the asp. This is the passage from Isaiah. And similarly, and the cow and the bear shall feed, and the lion shall eat straw like the ox. For dangerous beasts only prey on human beings on account of the sin of man, because of which it was decreed upon him that he be a prey to their teeth. And preying was a part of their nature, so that they also prey on each other. As is well known, for having once preyed on man, they add to this tendency that of preying on animals, so they become more harmful. And so Scripture states, and he learned to catch the prey, he devoured men. This is an amazing idea. We were all vegans in the Garden of Eden. Even the animals were vegan. Not only were we vegans, we were pacifists. And so the animals were pacifists. The whole nature of being violent only came into the world as a function of the sin of man. And the animals were victims of our sin. The only reason the animals became violent is as a result of sin, which then caused certain transformations in their character. Everything's our fault. And he goes on. I'm going to skip just a bit. Now, we know that the Garden of Eden, everyone's supposed to be vegan. That's explicit in the Torah. Okay, skip just a bit. Yeah, that's enough. That's enough for our purposes. So what emerges from this? That we have two very radical views of la'atid lavo, the perfect world. Is it Rambam, completely natural? The view in the Midrash of Rabbi Yehuda? Or is it the view of Rabbi Shimon in the Midrash, supernatural? That's the view of the Ravid, the view of the Ramban, a return to the Garden of Eden. So according to this, we will ultimately become vegans again when the world is perfected and the effects of sin is removed. Now, remember Rabbi Alexandrov? So he references this passage in the Talmud. Let's take a look at that. Here's the passage here about even more radical than what I showed you about there won't be korbanot. Amar Rav Yosef zot omeret mitzvot b'telot latid lavo. Mitzvot b'telot latid lavo. This is from the Talmud, Masechet Nida. This is not your local Reform rabbi. No mitzvot in the world to come. Now, if you had to guess how Rav Kook weighs in on this issue, is latid lavo the return to the Garden of Eden and the perfection and passivity, peacefulness, veganism that will prevail then? Or is it the Maimonidean conception, animal sacrifices, everything normal, all the laws of the Torah become reinstated like they are now? I think we would guess that Rav Kook holds like the mystics. Because we already saw, he says, that since the Garden of Eden represents the ideal, so Latid Lavo is the return to the Garden of Eden, and will be vegans again. Now, let's take a look at this really, really fascinating letter of Rav Kook.
But by the way, Alexandrov's letter is available. It's the only copy existing is in the U.S. at Harvard.
Wow! Can you forward to me?
I don't have the copy. But,
yeah, but whatever link where you found that out, that's fascinating.
Okay.
Yeah, amazing. Okay, so Rav Kook, this is in the middle of it's a very long letter, and he says, this is source 18. Kvodo merimanes et bitula mitzvot shel latid lavo. So you, Rabbi Alexandrov, you hold up as a banner, like a goal, that passage in the Talmud which says that mitzvot won't exist in the future. So therefore, kind of like this disaffection for mitzvot is, don't panic. I don't know, like in some ways it's a kind of a sign of progress, paradoxically. V'chein kulam. Now, Rav Kook goes on and he says, Umashma midvarav. It seems from, by the way, he addresses the recipient, Alexandrov, in the third person. That's just the way he shows respect, but he means you. So it seems from your words, I'll translate it in the second person just so it makes more sense to us. Shani cholek al yesod said that I must differ with this principle, that mitzvot won't exist in the world to come. Latid lavo. So they had this back and forth where Rabbi Alexandrov is a radical theologian, even though he's a very pious Jew. And Rabbi Alexandrov accuses Rav Kook of being overly conservative with a small c. You apparently, Rabbi Alexandrov said to Rav Kook, hold by another opinion of the Talmud that says mitzvot won't be betelot, won't be nullified in the world to come. Mishum shehineni yoter noter lemandamar in mitzvot betelot latid lavo. Because you think that I don't think that mitzvot will be nullified in the world to come. You accuse me of that. Now, here's this amazing statement from Rav Kook, and you're going to see an amazing insight into Rav Kook that I don't think a lot of people are aware of. Remember, we wanted to know, does Rav Kook hold by the Maimonidean conception of Latid Lavo, the world to come, or the mystical conception? Just keep that on the side for now. Rav Kook says to Rav Alexander, Lo kain yedidi. It's not true, my good friend, that I hold by the opinion that there'll be mitzvot in the world to come. Latid Lavo. Got to be careful with our expressions. Doesn't necessarily mean world to come in the sense of olam haba, but the perfected future, Latid Lavo, or they say in yeshivas, Lasid Lavo. Lasid Lavo. In Lasid Lavo will be mitzvot. You think I hold yes, but you hold no, like we saw that position in Talmud. Not true. Bazeh kamo b'chol hamachlokot yitzdak ma'od elu ve'elu divrei Elokim chayim. It says the following. I'm going to teach you something, Rav Kook says to Rabbi Alexandrov. Concerning this issue, as is true with all disputes, it is so true that we hold these and those are the words of the living God. Now that expression, these and those are the words of the living God, even though we have opinion of Beit Shammai, opinion of Beit Hillel, they seem to disagree. They're both the words of the living God. They're both right. So now, Rav Kook says that notion that both opinions are correct, especially is always true, but especially applies here. How? I don't know if you ever tried to think about this. You know, if I say the moon is made out of green cheese, and you say, no, it's made out of blue cheese, like, it's either made out of blue cheese or green cheese. Like, if we assume it's made out of cheese, right? How can it be that these are the words of the living God and those are the words of the living God too? You're both right. I don't get it. So look how Rav Kook applies that principle here. Hinenu kulanu mavchinim. All of us discern she'oto hamerchav shel latid lavo, that expanse that we call latid lavo, this perfected future, lasid lavo, hu kol kach bilti mugbal. It is so infinite. Kol kach rachav umekif. It is so wide and expansive. Ad she'ena makom tsar lachnis bo shtei adeyot zo achar zo. To the degree that there is no narrowness, which would then prevent both these opinions from existing sequentially. I just repeat it in my own words, that the notion of Latid Lavo is so expansive, wide, all-encompassing, that it is not too narrow. He says, look at the double A. It's not too narrow that it cannot incorporate both opinions, one after the other. Now he says it quite simply now. Yesh Latid Lavo she'ein mitzvot betilot bo. There's going to be a Latid Lavo in which mitzvot will not be nullified. But yesh Latid Lavo she'mitzvot betilot bo. But there will be a Latid Lavo in which the mitzvot will be nullified. Now, let's just talk about that for a second, because something now emerges, which is really now fundamental and big, and it's going to get bigger in a second. And that is the following. We have these two basic approaches towards Latid Lavo, perfected world. Is it Maimonidean, Rabbi Yehuda in the Midrash, that it's going to be a very civilized world of affluence, totally natural? So the animals won't come into Efrat. They'll stay in the forest, using that pasuk. And references to the fundamental change in nature of animals in the prophet Isaiah. It's just a mashal. It's just a metaphor for the notion of peace. Or the view of Rabbi Shimon in the Midrash, Ramban, Ravad, that no, miraculous supernatural transformation of the nature of existence. The beast will exist, but without the terrifying violent nature, because we're going to return to Gan Eden, and we'll all be vegan, and we'll offer up grain offerings in the holy temple that'll be in Gan Eden. Where's Ramban weigh in? It turns out, look what he's saying here. Latid Lavo is not static. Latid Lavo itself is a developmental state of existence in which, in the beginning, he says, mitzvot will be operative. And as it develops, mitzvot will no longer be operative. So what emerges is the third view that Rav Kook holds by the Rambam in the inception of Latid Lavo. The Messianic world initially will be Maimonidean, but it's not static. See, according to the Rambam, it's static, right? The Messianic world will be completely natural, and everybody dies. That's it. Even the Mashiach dies. So according to Rambam, then, so what's the point? No, the point is the disembodied existence of souls. According to the Kabbalists, Latid Lavo is a miraculous return to the Garden of Eden forever. Rav Kook says no and no, or yes and yes. It's both. You're right and you're right. These and those are the words of the living God. It depends upon what stage of Latid Lavo. Initially, it's Maimonidean. During that stage, we're going to eat meat, and we're going to offer up animal sacrifices, because it's going to be a more peaceful form of existence, but naturalistic. Rambam. But it's going to then proceed and develop, and then it's going to become the return to the Garden of Eden and supernatural. So that's why he responds to Rabbi Alexandrov and says, it's not that I reject the opinion that says mitzvot won't exist in the world to come, but it's Latid Lavo way, way, way in the future, right? But the more immediate Latid Lavo, I don't mean immediate in the sense of tomorrow, but whatever, first stage, there'll be mitzvot, there'll be animal sacrifices, we'll be eating meat, etc. Now we understand the seeming contradictions in Rav Kook. There's no contradictions whatsoever. When Rav Kook talks about the ideal state of Gan Eden, and then we're going to return to that eventually, it's the second stage of Latid Lavo. When Rav Kook himself ate meat and espoused eating meat for reasons we'll discuss in a second, that's because it's the initial stage of Latid Lavo. When Rav Kook talks about looking forward to being a Kohen Gadol, even ankle deep in the blood of the Korbanot, Rav Kook is talking about first stage Latid Lavo. When Rav Kook talks about offering up just grain offerings and no animal offerings, second stage Latid Lavo. We have solved that technical problem. Now, I'm going to tell you a personal story that actually kind of got me angry. So I'm going to first have a stiff drink, and then I'm going to tell you the story. So, like, I saw this passage in this letter to Rabbi Alexander. I said, wow, this really explicitly solves this problem, right? About these contradictions in his thinking, because he divides up Latid Lavo into these two stages. It's also a fascinating kind of compromise between these two different worldviews of the Maimonidean worldview versus the Kabbalistic worldview. And of course, this reflects his parents. I made this point in the past, like, a Litvish father and a Chabad mother, even though that's not really, that's only tongue-in-cheek, that last part, because even the Litvaks were also Kabbalists. Okay. Anyway, so this is great. I told it over to a friend of mine on a Motzei Shabbat a couple weeks ago. I was so excited. Oh, wow, I discovered this letter. It like solves all the problems. It's the Einstein unified field theory. I've discovered it. Answers all problems. So he's listening to me. And then he says, why is that important? I mean, I sort of it's like being slugged in the stomach. Like, what? I didn't even understand your question. You know, we got this huge contradiction in Rav Kook's thinking. I came up with a way to reconcile it. Like, I don't think it has to be explained. I actually was kind of angry. And I walked away, started thinking about it. I thought, why is this important?
Well, we talk about Mashiach coming every day, and it is a central part of our philosophy. We would like to know how it's going to work out.
Yeah. Okay. So that's I agree, and that's sort of what I meant when I said, like, what do you mean? Like, we have these two views, and now we have a way to sort of reconcile these sources, especially within Rav Kook. But then I was thinking, there's something much deeper here, and I want to share that with you. I think there's something very profound here. Take a look. Yeah, Bruce, go ahead.
If we're debating, a historical past event or something where they have to paskin a shaila. So then, one could say, well, one may be right over the other because we have a process to reach a resolution. This is about a future event of which only a Navi could tell us, and therefore, on the multiple choice answer to this question, it's A, B, none of the above, all the above, or we don't really know. And you might end up by saying, well, we don't really know, or as you're trying to say here, kind of like from Rav Kook's perspective, all the above. But at the end of the day, like your friend said, we don't really know. It's just a nice academic place to have our mind at, that a certain problem has an intellectual resolution. But in terms of what Danny's saying, we believe in Mashiach. Well, but we don't really know.
No, his friend, but Bruce, his friend wasn't saying he didn't know. He said he didn't care.
Yeah.
Didn't make any difference.
Yeah.
Only because there's no halak, there's no nafkamin in it. That's all.
Okay. So hang on a second. So actually, someone had their microphone. I was like, there's a lot of noise in the background. So whoever that was probably should turn off their microphone. But so I want to address this little machloka here between Bruce and Danny. So I hear you saying, Bruce, but I actually think that I'm more sympathetic with Danny, but there's something else going on here. You'll see right now. It leads me to this profundity now. We're going to finish now our topic. I want to return to a paragraph in Rav Kook's essay on vegetarianism. We actually should call it veganism, which Arthur wanted to mention, but I wouldn't let him. Okay. Take a look at this. Here, Rav Kook, despite the fact that he wrote a whole essay on the significance of having a sense of value to even animal life, and that we shouldn't, there's a certain amount of cruelty in taking animal life even now. But he says, don't make it public policy to become a vegan now. It shouldn't become public policy. I mean, if Bruce wants to be a vegan, that's okay, but like, it shouldn't become public policy. So look at what he says here. And just as it is the case with whoever hastily professes a level of piety so unsuitable that it only brings confusion to that person's thinking and way of life, so it is with humanity in general. We'll explain what this means in a minute. Even the English is hard. In that it has fallen to the lowest level of moral decline, to the extent that the power which one human being exercises over another has become detrimental, and to the point where the basest kind of personal moral decline occurs. Humanity is abominable and filthy, drinking iniquity like water. Whoever thought that Rav Kook thought that everything was so wonderful and rosy and Mashiach would come tomorrow should read this paragraph. How ludicrous it would be if humanity, as long as its impurities are within it, would hypocritically turn to a far-fetched way of righteousness, showing itself to be righteous only with regard to animals, as if all accounts between human beings created in the divine image had been settled, as if everything had already been set right, and the rule of evil and falsehood had been banished, as if hatred between peoples, national rivalries, religious animosity, and family strife, and the relations between Republicans and Democrats, which caused so many moral casualties and spill so much blood, as if all these had already disappeared from the earth, and the only way left in which to elevate human piety was to attend to the establishment of a moral foundation in regards to animals. Therefore, this is not a fitting standard for humanity in general, as long as humanity remains in its state of moral baseness, except insofar as it does not overtax the capacity which it is possible with the force of human morality and even its weakened state to sustain. There is no doubt that the prohibition of the killing of animals was made known as a religious and moral pronouncement, public policy to be vegan, issuing from the untainted sensibility of divine justice, whose nature it is to radiate out to all creatures and to instill the recognition that the holiness of God's gifts suffuses all living beings and all humanity. If this permission were to be enforced as public policy, while at the same time the general moral condition were still impaired, and the spirit of impurity had not passed from the world, there's no doubt that this circumstance would result in many impediments to spiritual progress. We'll explain this in a second. I just want to finish reading the words, which is really fascinating. Wow. When the animal-like craving to eat meat would become overpowering, it would then make no distinction between the flesh of a human being and the flesh of animals, since in any case, the eating of the life of the animal as well as the human being is proscribed as a prohibition, a violation of law, and the killing of sacrificing of human beings in order to eat their flesh would become a widespread phenomenon. The eating of human flesh would become so natural that once the wide gap between human beings and animals in terms of the relative value of their lives has been breached, there would no longer be any trace of the natural abhorrence to this practice, which humanity in its improved state possesses at the present time. Okay, so let me just say this in plain English. Kook says the following. Let's say that Bruce becomes prime minister and chief rabbi of the Jewish people. We're going to make kind of like a dual task function there. And the Sanhedrin is reconstituted and says that given the fact that we're now living in this wonderful state of Reshit Smichat Gulatenu, the first finding of our redemption, so we are going to incorporate a more perfected way of living our lives by being vegans, and now becomes the law that all Jewish people must be vegan. And the Sanhedrin promulgates this as public policy. We are all vegans now. Rav Kook says, you know what's going to happen as a result of that? So since we are still basically rotten people, right now, if Bruce tomorrow were to try to do this, yeah, but right now, we're a bunch of animals ourselves. So we will implement in our school educational system to teach everybody that dolphins, human beings, we're all the same. Life is sacred. Even they have dot. We have dot. It's all groovy. Peace and love. We're in the Garden of Eden. So they'll hear the message, but they won't be able to abide by it because we're still in a very low moral state. So you know what we're going to do? There is going to become a underground market in meat. People want to eat meat because we're still primitive. We're still cruel, except for Bruce. So, but Bruce, because of his own spiritual state of advancement, he thinks that everybody can live that way. So it becomes now public policy, but we're not ready for it. So there's a huge underground now of killing animals and eating them because we like it. A barbecue, a couple of beers, and the Super Bowl. What could be better than that? No way we're going to give that up. So wait a second. So my teacher told me from first grade to 12th grade that animal life and human life, both sacred. Therefore, we shouldn't eat them. So in my brain, I'm thinking, okay, I got this message, but I've been eating meat surreptitiously. There's all these speakeasies during the Prohibition, right? They go in there, but we're not liquor, right? It's meat, eating meat. So I become now insensitized to the fact that I can eat meat, I can kill an animal, but that animal is my equal, because that's what I learned since first grade. We're all the same, but I want to eat them. Well, if I eat them and I'm now desensitized to eating my cousins, lion, tigers, and bears, you know who I'm going to kill now with impunity? My cousins in Efrat, the human cousins, because we're all the same. So rather than elevating the sacredness towards life by insisting on public policy to be vegan now, it will actually lower the sacredness of human life, because we're the same as animals, but I eat animals. So if I eat animals, kill them, no problem, right? I don't feel any pangs of conscience. Well, I'm not going to feel any pangs of conscience killing people either. It's going to result in mass cannibalism. I mean, that makes it sound a little funny, but the idea is very compelling. If we think that human life and animal life are the same on an intellectual level, but on a level of our ability to control ourselves, we can't, and we like meat. So we kill animals because our ancestors did that 50 years ago. But our moral sensitivity hasn't changed. So if I can kill an animal who I'm somehow kind of an equal to in some way, I can also kill a human being who I'm an equal to in the other way.
Could you extrapolate this idea to public policy of, let's say, keeping Shabbat?
Okay.
Or any public policy idea?
Yeah. That's what I'm about to do right now. So now, I remember I told you that there now is going to result in implication, which I think is really, when my friend said to me, like, why is this important? This is why it's important. You know what Rav Kook is really saying? His notion of Latid Lavo, stages, is deeply embedded in his conception that things progress with a certain momentum. And when you try to get ahead of yourself too fast, it's a disaster. It's a disaster. Everything has to be done in its right time. And we try to pretend that we are more advanced than we are. It results in tragedy. And this is the example here. Now, let's talk about this principle in our own lives and public policy. So Bruce said, let's make a real Jewish state. Chilul Shabbat, desecrating Shabbat in public. You get for that 30 years in prison. Whatever. Obviously, it's an ideal that all Jewish people should keep Shabbat. We're not there yet. We're not there. And we try to push things too soon. It's counterproductive is not the word. It's an understatement. Let's talk about this on a personal level. Everything happens in its own time. And we try to push ourselves to do something which is positive, but we're not ready. Does not work. And it's even counterproductive. And everybody can think of an example in their own lives about this, whether it's getting a certain amount of exercise or having a certain type of discipline or whatever it may be. You have to be right. The conditions have to be right. And if the conditions aren't right and we don't live up to the ideal, then we just beat ourselves up. I'm so lousy. I should be learning Daf Yomi. I should have been through Shas 20 times already. I'm horrible. No, you're not right. It's not the time yet. Not the time yet. Have to have patience. Called the barbito. Everything in its right time. How about the way we relate to our kids? Why aren't you more religious? Why ain't you this? Why aren't you that? All those things are good values and important. They're not ready for it. They're not ready to hear it. Maybe in 5 years or 10 years. You have to be ready. The conditions have to be right. Now, it turns out that this idea is not a new idea. I mean, it's actually common sense, but it's not very common. The Talmud discusses this in the context of King David. It's exact principle. It says that King David, the way he married Bathsheba, a little problematic there. He killed her husband so he could marry her. Talmud says, you know what? She was destined to be his wife, but the conditions weren't right. And it uses that exact expression. It was like eating, the Talmud says, a unripened fig. Everything has to happen in its right time. And when you push things, terrible things happen. Things have to evolve and ripen in their own pace. Now, how do you know when conditions are ready? There's no objective way of determining that, but we have to have our eyes wide open and be patient and understanding that even good things are only appropriate when conditions are right at the right time. Latid lavo bet, machzor bet, moed bet, the right time. The second stage, latid lavo. When we try to push things too fast, we become cannibals. This is the meta message that emerges from this analysis. I think it's like a really profound idea, both in terms of public policy, the way we relate to ourselves, relate to those around us. Patience. Even when something is a good goal, timing has to be right. We have to be bashel. We have to be right, ready to be receptive to that, the next development. On that note, we have finished our topic, and we will go on, Bezrat Hashem, with a new and exciting topic next week.
That grows up.
My pleasure. Take care.